Hello, I'm Donal McCauley, and welcome to Medics Voices, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today we're in Glasgow, and I'm talking to Graham Watt. Now, Graham, you've done lots of very interesting things in your academic career, but let's bring you back to the very beginning. What got you interested in medicine?
I'm not sure how well thought out it was. I think I had a broad idea that it was to do with people, and that was the direction I wanted to go in. It was obviously also a very respectable thing to do. There weren't medics in my family apart from an uncle who died in the war. So I think I wouldn't say that I stumbled into it, but I didn't go into it with a very clear set of ideas. I I did go on a quite a long and convoluted journey to get from there to where I ended up, which and I was always aware of a kind of an instinct or a plan guiding my decisions. Although it was only sort of when I retired that I started to work out what the plan was. And I'm not sure that the path that I followed is followable now because things are much tighter in terms of the options. But I had an instinctive interest in generalism. I think also in inclusion and fairness and the idea that medicine included everybody. And the key to that was epidemiology, because that involved a denominator, and the challenge was to get everybody into the numerator. And a group of us in the British Medical Students Association, many of whom became professors, and we wrote a letter on the Lancet about how do you do clinical epidemiology when epidemiology belongs to public health medicine, which has, as an article of faith in those days, sort of prevented you from seeing patients. I found as a student reading Tudor Hart stuff in the Lancet just exhilarating. I mean, it was iconoclastic. It didn't take any prisoners. It was very lucid writing. It was intoxicating stuff to read if you were slightly against the establishment. And medical schools were certainly establishment organizations in those days. And Julian was also, with what he called anticipatory care, he was pioneering population medicine, what he would call shoe leather epidemiology as opposed to desk-based epidemiology, wearing out the soles of your shoes, not the seat of your pants, as he put it. So I went as a medical student in my attachment down there, the first Scot to go there, and gosh, that was a life-changing 2 weeks. The life was lived large in that household. A complete mixture of life and work. Helped because there was two of them, not just Julian Tudor Hart, but Mary Hart, who worked with him at the MRC unit, and he couldn't have done what he did without her. She was his anchor and the research manager, and the chair of the board of the local school. So they were thoroughly into the local community. And I just left Glyncorrwg determined that whatever I did in medicine, I was going back there. It was just a very rich experience, which energized me for the next 40 years and still does. I've got pictures of the visitors book from Glyncorrwg. It's about 30 pages. There must be about 700 or 800 people who visited, and it's a list of the movers and shakers in on the sort of radical side of medicine.
You've gone as a medical student to Glyncorrwg, and
Yeah.
then you did various jobs, one of which, I mean, Aberdeen is in the far north, but you did a hospital job in Shetland.
Well, I'd been on holiday there, and I knew I wasn't going to do surgery ever again, so I wanted to do it in an interesting place. Being the sort of houseman in the Gilbert Bain in Lerwick with an Egyptian SHO who had thought Shetland was in the Thames estuary when he applied for the job, and and Ronnie Cumming, the surgeon, who was the last of a breed who could do absolutely everything. When he retired, it took 3 people to replace him. I had a huge escape when I applied for a medical registrar job at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. Thank goodness I didn't get that. That would have set me in a completely different path. So then I went to healthcare of the elderly at Nottingham, attracted by Tom Airy, who was a charismatic professor. He wrote things like the House of Lords was an ideal care home for the elderly, because it gave them a sense of purpose and warmth and food and a stipend. It was just a pity that most elderly people couldn't enjoy that. And then I went from there to the Glyncorrwg job for 2 years, following people like John Robson in London and Andy Haynes, who'd been there before me. There was about 20 of us, and we did a reunion once, because we talked about the unofficial University of Glyncorrwg, with a one-man faculty of Julian. We didn't tell them we were doing a reunion. So one Friday night, sitting in the Queen's, which was the converted small hotel that they made their family home, suddenly somebody would arrive out of nowhere, unexplained, and Julian would think this was wonderful. And then 10 minutes later, somebody else would appear out of nowhere. And it was only about the third or fourth person arriving that he trigged that something special was happening, and this wasn't a series of coincidences. So there's John Fry, who went to Madison in the States, was another. And we were all sort of fired with this experience. But actually, as a student and as a visitor to the practice, and being able to sit in his surgeries, you saw him being a doctor, which was very interesting. I mean, he was, in his own words, he was didactic to begin with, because he was trying to do things quickly, and he evolved into the sort of co-production model of, and in his words, initially face to face, moving gradually to side by side.
You've recorded a fabulous interview where you discuss Julian in great detail, and we'll put a link to this on the interview. But what I'm really interested in is the influence that Julian had on you and your career.
When I became the professor, I really felt I was on. I wouldn't say it was missionary work, but it was the advocacy I wanted to do. Was his example, of looking after a whole population, using your denominator to measure what you hadn't done, for example. On reflection, the world I was working in wasn't ready for that. It was sort of about 15 years later that Julian became much more acceptable as a flag bearer.
So after you've done these house jobs and you've done your membership and you've been to Glyncorrwg, you then took a job in epidemiology, and you were very involved in the Monica project.
I came to Glasgow University, 3 years, WHO Monica, a big study, registering coronary heart attacks under 65, fatal and non-fatal, to look at trends. Were trends in coronary heart disease due to changes in incidence, the disease becoming more common or disappearing, or was it due to case fatality, better treatment or less severity? And that needed 40 countries in different settings around the world to count coronaries. And the good thing from my point of view is it was working with Hugh Tunstall-Pedo in Dundee. There was another centre in Edinburgh which never got off the ground. The good thing from my point of view was that it was a full-time job, but I could do it in half the time, so I could do other things. And actually, one of the other things was what we called the Ladywell family blood pressure study. I found myself in a practice in Edinburgh which had taken part in the MRC hypertension trial. I knew Bill Mile, who led that trial, so I asked if I could get the screening cards, and we didn't need very much money from the chief scientist's office to collect blood pressures on their adolescent and young adult children, about 1,000 of them. So we, having studied families in Glyncorrwg, selecting them on the basis of parental blood pressures, both of the parental blood pressures, repeated that at Ladywell and did a whole series of studies with the MRC blood pressure unit who had never previously been exposed to that kind of opportunity. And then I moved on, and I never was formally trained in epidemiology, apart from shoe leather epidemiology in Glyncorrwg and the big sort of data collection exercise of Monica. I didn't have any sort of training in it, and I always felt slightly deficient in that respect. And I've always been dependent on statisticians as a result of that for the number crunching. So one of my skills has been to maintain productive relationships with a whole variety of statisticians, which is sometimes a bit of a challenge. Anyway, from that, then I had to start complete. I got married to my wife Liz, who's a lecturer at the School of Art. We're starting a family, so I had to start thinking about how I was going to earn a salary. So I completed vocational studies training at Townhead underneath the Royal Infirmary. Had the option of going into practice, but felt it would be too confining, and went rather reluctantly into community medicine training. And unfortunately I was headhunted actually to become the professional secretary of the Health Services Research Committee in the Chief Scientist Office, which was a great 2 years in government as a civil servant, Official Secrets Act, all of that. But being at the centre of health services research in Scotland was great in terms of contacts, information, and also the business of getting grants. I mean, I became quite good at getting grants. It was only ever going to be a temporary thing. And then I jumped into public health academia in Glasgow in environmental. I did a series of jobs for which I had no training at all. The chief scientist, environmental medicine, did studies of lead in water, chromium, contamination of land, air pollution, the midspan studies on the side. And I thought I'd burnt my boats in terms of academic general practice, because I was given up clinical work. I was in academic public medicine, and then the vacancy in Glasgow came up. I wasn't thinking of applying, and then John Howie, bless him, in Edinburgh knew I'd been in Glyncorrwg and knew I would have something to offer. So I didn't need a second invitation. I just went for it. And in retrospect, I was an atypical professor of general practice. The first wave of professors were plucked from practice, and they were an amazing group of people. They wouldn't pass muster in terms of what universities expect of academics these days, which is both a positive and a negative. But the irony is, and I used to enjoy irritating colleagues in public health by pointing out that if you've got public health in your job title, you probably don't have any contact with the public. Whereas if you do have contact with the public, the last thing you think about is public health. But often people talk about the marriage of general practice and public health as if they were one and the same. But actually, in terms of a marriage, they haven't really done very much dating and don't necessarily understand each other very well.
Well, in fact, Graham, you brought that marriage to fruition between your public health, your general practice, your experience of Glyncorrwg, and your epidemiology. And that all came to fruition in the deep end.
It did. It did.
The deep end.
It did. I think that the other advantage I had as a professor was I was fairly senior in the small department, so that allowed me to fashion it is the wrong to do it in the way that I wanted, and I had some very good younger colleagues, and eventually, in the 15 years I was head of department, I think of the people who were there then 23 became professors. So there was something about it that was a good place to work, which I feel quite proud about. The government wanted to match an RCGP report on what GPs could do to address health inequalities. And they asked Public Health in Glasgow to set up a meeting. So we had a very conventional conference. Speakers, Iona Heath was there, GPs in the back row, and not contributing, going away at the end. 2 weeks later, the meeting might as well not have taken place. It was a false start. We had the opportunity 2 years later to do it in our own way. And so we'd identified the 100 most deprived practices on paper, and now we had the opportunity to invite them to a meeting, which took quite a lot of effort to get 2/3 of them to come. We had locum funding to get them out of practice for the day, which was originally coming from the college, remarkably, and then the government matched it. And we had three sort of decisions. One was that we wouldn't produce a report on health inequalities because there was far too many of them. We wouldn't give GPs a toolkit because that was patronizing, and we would listen to what they had to say. And we didn't invite anybody else who could be a lightning conductor for whining or negativity, an unnecessary precaution, because there was an immediate buzz in the room, first time they'd been convened or consulted, and we never really looked back. The Deep End projects are oases of positivity and energy and passion about the future of general practice in particular types of areas, quite against the tide, really, of doom and gloom that you get. And indeed, there's plenty to be gloomy about in terms of general practice, in terms of the pressures that it's under. So I characterize the Deep End movement, and there's 20 projects worldwide now, so there's something generic about them. I see it as a resistance movement of like-minded colleagues committed to the future, determined to influence the future, and riding out bad times.
When I listen to you talk about the Deep End as a resistance movement and the redistribution, there are echoes of Julian Tudor Hart from the very beginning of your career. It really is a fascinating way that it's all come around.
No, there's a very explicit link. I mean, there's a lot of Julian stuff in the early Deep End literature. He was very keen about it. He gave us some great quotes to use, because by his own admission, he didn't have a big local impact in terms of influencing general practice in Wales, which has been quite. It's got a Deep End project now, but it took 10 years for it to happen. I think it was a profit in your own land type of thing, and his example was actually also very threatening, I think, to local GPs, because he put so much energy into it. Not everyone was up for that kind of input. And I think that the strength of the Deep End movement is that it connects people who would otherwise be isolated, and that is empowering. And people said that yesterday at the Scottish Steering Group meeting. Being part of something bigger than yourself that's moving in the direction that you want to go in is Daniel Pink, the American, writes about the three sources of professional satisfaction: autonomy, having some decisions, license over your choices; mastery, being good at what you do and being valued for it; and purpose, in the sense of moving towards some longer term aim in the company of others. And they are antidotes to burnout, basically, in deprived areas. And the messages are very simple. I reduce it to 3 building programs, not bricks and mortar, but relationships. One is building strong patient narratives based on their experience and their wishes. 2 is building strong local health systems around the hub of a general practice, because it's got this contact and continuity that few public services have. And the 3rd thing is building a network of such systems. People have an idea of the challenge of building long-term relationships with patients, but building relationships with colleagues and with other practices is a similar kind of challenge, and you wouldn't presume to do it fast. The difficult one of the challenges of the Deep End is that you're building all these relationships sort of in parallel, whereas in terms of the energy and time that's available to you, you can really only do them in series. And something that I've learned is if you want to change things, it's much easier if you don't want credit for it. Allow other people to have credit for it because they must have ownership. And I think Julian's influence now is not as the sort of figurehead or champion of change, but as the person who sort of lit the fuse a long time ago, and other people are sort of carrying it on now.
Now, we've talked about general practice, we've talked about the deep end, we've talked about not quite the serious issues of life and death. We're now going to talk about something much more serious, and that's your interest in football itself.
Well, I'm a trustee for the Scottish. I'm a vice chairman of the Scottish Professional Football League Trust, which is a charity which sort of coordinates and supports the charitable wings of the 42 professional football clubs in Scotland, and it's harnessing the social power of football because football clubs do generate passion. I think it's partly because even when you leave an area, you quite often continue to support the club because it's a source of memory and history and locality. And there's a flagship study called FIT, Football Fans in Training, which targets men with waistlines more than 38 inches. And it gives them a 12-week course of nutrition and exercise advice done in a group at the football ground of their choice. And unusually for such an intervention, people lose weight and they keep it off. And there's nothing original about the intervention other than the fact that it takes place at a football club of their choice. And what I think it's doing is it's harnessing the emotional energy that's linked to football clubs in order for a public health intervention. And as well as that, there's mental health projects, there's Festive Friends, which gives the demented people and their carers a Christmas lunch at the football club of their choice. Several, so it's I think it's like the deep end for me in the sense that it's a network. Your only authority comes from whether you're valued as a sort of central support. That's certainly true of the deep end. My great-grandfather was born in a croft and became the editor of the Aberdeen Free Press. And his son, my grandfather, was a printer, obsolete now, but he produced. He was secretary of the school, former pupils club, and produced 3 magazines a year for 40 years and created a worldwide network of former pupils. Quite anachronistic in many ways, but on reflection, I'm doing the same sort of thing. I've got myself into a number of roles of being at this centre. There's a great quote from Montaigne, the French philosopher, I've gathered a posy of other men's flowers, and the only thing of mine is the thread that binds them. I like that analogy. And also the Robert Louis Stevenson, that it's better to travel hopefully than to arrive, and the true success is to labour. I like that one a lot, and used to advise people, and the labour part means doing your best work now, not leaving it for the future. And another Robert Louis Stevenson quote was, what matters is not the harvest you reap, it's the seeds that you sow.
Graham, it's been fantastic to finish off with those quotes that reflect the philosophy. Thank you very much for sharing your life, your academic career, and the influences. Thank you very much indeed. It's been
it's a bit like desert island discs, isn't it? Thank you very much for the opportunity.